exhibition Cyclone Idai, which is in partnership with a number of organizations. And today we are going to be discussing on the issues to do with disaster planning and disaster recovery. And with one of the panelists is Pauline Hurungudo, who is the communications officer with the International Rescue Committee, which is one of the partners for the Cyclone Idai exhibition, which we're actually hosting online, and you can actually go on the National Gallery website for you to be able to view that exhibition, which is marking 1 year after Cyclone Idai, the disaster that struck our communities in Chimanimani and Chipinge. And as we are talking right now, according to the news, people are still in tents. People still needs to be assisted one way or the other. But one of the most important things is for the relocation of those communities into decent accommodation, which is one of the key things, which I think if one is talking about disaster planning and disaster recovery, it is exactly what we are talking about, what we're going to be discussing, and what our panelist, Pauline Hurungudo, is going to be touching on. So good afternoon, Pauline. Hello, good afternoon, Pauline.
Afternoon, Raphael. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much for joining us for this important conversation. Like I was saying earlier on, that the topic of the discussion this afternoon is disaster planning and disaster recovery. And I'm sure from the news headlines which we had last week or this week, that many people in both Chimanimani and Chipinge are still in tents, and they still need decent accommodation. They need relocation into somewhere where they can call home. And when I heard from one of the person who talked on radio, I'm sure it was two ladies who were talking about how the accommodation they actually occupy at the moment, that it does not provide for mostly the girl child and the boy child, that they have to, if they want to relieve themselves, is just around behind the tent, which I think this conversation will really touch into disaster planning and disaster recovery. So without wasting much of our time, I would like you maybe to really start by touching on the issues about disaster planning. What is disaster planning? How do you work on a disaster planning issue? Thank you. Hello, Pauline.
When we were looking at our response to the situation in terms of our planning, we did a rapid assessment of the damage caused. When we're talking about rapid assessment, we are talking about the response within 72 hours. We need to have, when it's an emergency. So what we did was we did a rapid assessment of the damage that was caused by the communities. And like I said, the communities were left in dire need of water, in dire need of sanitation, and some of the needs and resources, like I mentioned, the urgent needs, some of them needed to be given to the communities ASAP, while some of them could be worked on as, you know, as time was moving. They were long term, they were not very short term. But the communities, like what the colleague that just spoke was talking about, houses that some people are still, you know, do not have proper housing. People still do not have proper infrastructure, which is perhaps some of the things that still need to be done in the long term. But talking about now disaster preparedness, going back to probably before the actual emergency, we're talking about the resources that are generally supposed to be there. For example, the policies that are supposed to be there and the procedures that are supposed to be there mostly within a country, which needs to, which can help to effectively, assist the people when a disaster occurs. I think, with our current economic situation, like our health system is a bit bad and things like that. I think it has been difficult for us to be well prepared in advance, but we know that humanitarian organizations have been coming in a lot. Organizations like ours have been coming in a lot to also complement government efforts. So talking about now in our emergency response as the IRC, I think one thing that was very important after the rapid assessment that I spoke about was our immediate response, where we were focusing on life-saving mechanism. Like I said, when the floods came, the rivers and tributaries burst, and homes, schools, were damaged, and some people even died. So at the end of the day, people needed something, a life-saving, people had urgent needs. Allow me to say that people had urgent needs. People were in need of food. People were in need of, clean water and things like that. So those were some of the things we managed to do in terms of our immediate response in providing life-saving mechanism. We provided food packs, emergency wash response, like for example, chemicals, bottled water, which were in the short term things that people needed at that moment. Those who were sick, we provided nurses. We provided nurses for the Ministry of Health so that they'll take care of people who had been affected. Also midwives, so that they were pregnant women who were there and things like that. At the same time, now in the long term, the other things that we then moved in to do, which are very important when we are talking about emergency response. In the long term, we rehabilitated water sources in Chipinge and Chimanimani, the springs. I think most of the people here know that in Chimanimani, their water comes from springs, and most of it was damaged by the cyclone. So all of those things were very important to help rehabilitate the people. And like the other speaker mentioned earlier, that life is getting a bit back to normal. For example, the boreholes, the water canals that were used by people to water their gardens. All of those things needed to be done. But at the end of the day, allow me to say, when we are talking about recovery, recovery can be a long-term thing that still needs to be done. Like you mentioned, Raphael, to say there's so much that still needs to be done. While we can say, okay, we have helped 2,000 households now have water, we have helped people now have latrines. We built 452 latrines for 452 households. We can talk about all of that. But yes, like you said, there's still things that need to be done. There are people like near Kopa, for example. I was there myself just before the first lockdown. There are people who are still living in tents. And some of the stories that we hear, that when it rains, people are still scared. They try to go to relatives who are living in proper houses and move from tents. All of those things need to be done. So there is still work that needs to be done. But from the humanitarian side, it's always influenced by the funding available. So I think they still need for us to collaborate. They still need for government to move in. People are still living in tents, it's true. So there's a long-term recovery that is still needed. While we have done other things, I also believe that there are other things that we can still do to change the lives of people. There are still, I forgot to mention also, part of our response, even in the long term, we built safe spaces for women, is particularly those who are affected by gender-based violence. Allow me to share a bit on that, to say some of the stories that we were getting. For example, a woman was affected where the husband is always beating her up, saying, "You are the one that caused the other child to die." Because what happened was, when the flood happened, the father carried one of the son and the mother carried the daughter. And so when the mom was carrying the daughter, the eldest daughter, while the father was carrying the younger one. The flood then, you know, I think it was the flood then came, and then the daughter went, the daughter was then, you know, then passed away, and all of that happened. And afterwards, now the father was saying, you know, you are the one who killed the other child because of the flood. So at the end of the day, the husband would beat up the wife saying, this is what you did. And, you know, the wife suffered a lot of physical abuse. So those are some of the stories that we were dealing with. And so we built safe spaces where women and girls would go and, you know, and find refuge. But what you would find now is that some of those cases, we reached, in our statistics, we reached over 4,000 women in Chipinge and Chimanimani, but you'll find that there are so many cases that we still don't know by now. So there's still more that needs to be done. So these are things that are happening now way after the cyclone, you know. So these are the effects that are still there, which I was just giving you to show you the importance of the long-term recovery, like the other lady spoke about that. Those things still need to continue. Because while it's more than a year later, the people are still living from the effects of the Cyclone Idai. So in terms of gender-based violence, we had a robust women and protection emergency support that we still have the safe spaces in Chimanimani where women are still able to go. But like I'm saying, they still, you know, much that needs to be done. And like what you said, Raphael, we need all hands on deck. You know, there's still more that needs to be done in Chimanimani and Chipinge. Thank you. Sorry, I took a lot of time.
No, I'm sure this is your time, because I would like to rewind to the conversation we had last week with Jackie from Miracle Missions and Becky Manzo from the Meteorological Department. What, Jackie, we talked about the idea of disaster preparedness, and now we're talking about disaster planning, whereby they talked about the idea of having a disaster committee, disaster management committee that us as Zimbabwe should put in place in order to mitigate some of the challenges that those people affected by the Cyclone Idai are facing today. What do you think about that?
I think specifically, okay, like I said in the beginning, that in terms of our disaster preparedness as a nation, I think we can do more. But like you said, I think if it's specifically to do with Chipinge, you know, with Manicaland, sorry, I think I would really support that. You know, I think the other thing that we need to know, especially when planning and preparing for these things, is that that area is, because of geographically, it's somehow said to be prone to such disasters. And I think in Mozambique also faces the same thing. They are prone to flooding. That area is prone to flooding. If you've been there inside, I think there's it's a wet area. There's so much water there, and so it's and people live in should I say hillsides and stuff like that. And one other thing I should mention in that is that where people used to live and, you know, they were affected by the cyclone, for some of the beneficiaries who benefited our projects, they are still there. They went back to the same places because people were saying, okay, this is where we get our livelihood and stuff like that. So I think it's a very good idea. And I think it should be processed quickly. If it is brought in by the relevant authorities, I think it's something that is important, because we should not live in oblivion saying, okay, it just happened, it might not happen again, because the area geographically, we know that it's actually prone to floods, it's actually prone to that. So I think it's very important for us to maybe do something like that, which will help us probably in our planning, and also which will help us to restore. Because like I said, they still need to restore, you know, livelihoods in that area. While we are doing a lot of things, while we have done so much, while there are many organizations, I know there's also Gold there, there's also Mercy Corps there, there are many organizations working there. But I tell you, the whole area, in our estimation, the people who are affected, it's around 250,000 people. And so this is, I don't know in terms of percentage, but it's a huge percentage in our population. So I think a committee, whether it's a committee for that area only, or it's a national committee for disaster preparedness, I think it is key in order for coordination as well. I think one thing that helped us last time was coordination, which is very important. It's very key when we have disasters such as those ones. So I think a committee will be best in terms of our planning. So it means when you have a committee, it's easier to plan, it's easier to have ideas synchronized together in order for us not to haphazardly, respond, or not to haphazardly, assist the communities we are serving. So I would totally support that, Raphael.
How coordinated are all these international organizations, the local organizations, in terms of the long-term recovery of the people of Chimanimani and Chipinge?
Well, as far as I can tell, like looking from the Cyclone Idai, I think because we are all working with government line ministries at district development, at district level. And for example, the Cyclone Idai was the Ministry of Local Government, which was coordinating people. I think with at first there were a bit of some challenges, but I think the sector coordination that was assisted by government and also by different clusters, I think actually helped. So I think generally, I think, as you know, humanitarian organizations, we are coordinated. We work together with the district offices in those communities we are working in. So largely, they are the ones who are involved in, assisting us on how we can best assist the people affected. So last time, during the Cyclone Idai, there was the Ministry of Local Government, which was really in charge of most of those things. So I think in terms of coordination, there is coordination, but a committee, I think, would be best in terms of sort of like this, so that we have a center and not have it decentralized, because mostly in the district we are working in, the coordination mostly comes from the district, and the district officers, the district office, the DA's office, and things like that. So I think there is need for more coordination, of course, like a committee, for example, but there are clusters. But with preparedness now, I think there should be something that just stays, not necessarily for that certain disaster, but a committee that is able to, generally be in charge, generally take charge when such things happen. Yeah.
Okay, given the discussions on the issues of devolution, do you think because of devolution, committees or disaster planning committees it's easier for them to be put in place?
Sorry, Raphael, pardon, may you please repeat?
Because of devolution that is coming into effect as we are talking now, do you think this could be a noble idea for that devolution to come out with their disaster committees whenever a disaster happens?
I think probably when we're looking at devolution now, not knowing exactly how it will come out when it is eventually, when it eventually becomes law. I think the committees are very key, especially when devolution comes. Why? It's because, like I said, for example, with the coordination of the Cyclone Idai, we had the Ministry of Local Government coming in largely, and the minister coordinating from the national level, coming to the district level. So I think the committee would really help, not only for example, Cyclone Idai, for the effects that we're trying to deal with, but I think it will help at a national level, because when you have a committee that that then gets experience in dealing with such disasters in Zimbabwe because they don't happen every day. But the issue is you want a committee that is experienced in dealing with disasters, that knows what to do, that knows how to coordinate organizations instead of waiting for a minister, a department, like for example, because a department, remember, it's always changing. The DA will always change. The people working in government will always change. But when you have a committee that specifically deals with disaster, then it becomes easier in terms of, you know, setting a standard that is followed when we have disasters in Zimbabwe. So I think looking at devolution, while even, you know, devolution might mean that we are working more with the local authorities, I think a committee would still be very important. It would still be key in order for continuity, which is very key when we are talking about, you know, disaster preparedness for the future.
You talked earlier on about safe spaces for women and girls, and also talking about the domestic violence that is increasing in those who are actually staying in tents and all that. What do you think could be done in order to mitigate? I mean, we know very well that because of COVID-19 and lockdowns, domestic violence has just erupted. And one of those people within, if you are talking about the a long-term recovery for the people of Chimanimani and Chipinge, and those who are, we already have created those safe spaces for them.
Okay, so I think, you know, gender-based violence is something that continues to hammer our nation from each and every end, particularly with the COVID-19, which we are also trying to respond to, not only in Manicaland, but in other areas as well. But if I'm to talk about specifically Cyclone Idai and our safe spaces, I think one key issue, you know, to GBV is restoration of livelihoods. Because some of the cases that you hear about GBV and some of the causes of gender-based violence that we are saying largely are linked to, you know, livelihoods, where you hear someone saying, because, you know, because of poverty, because I'm not doing anything, I don't have money or something like that, they are constantly being battered and things like that. So you will find that, not that we are saying it's an excuse, you know, to say if you are not doing financially well, you are supposed to be physically abusing your partner. But I think some of those things need to be addressed. You know, like we are saying that there are so many things that still need to be addressed with regards to Cyclone Idai. Let me bring you to some of the things, for example, in terms of some of the issues that we experienced. When the moment Cyclone Idai happened, because some women and, you know, their children and families had to live in one room, some of the cases that started happening, we actually started hearing stories of incest happening, because children, girls and boys, will be looking at what their parents are doing, and at the end of the day, they are copying, and we now have incest. We talk of cases where we now had, you know, some being sexually abused and things like that. So all of those were emanating, because remember I said they were living in one room. So because of those effects of Cyclone Idai, gender-based violence or sexual violence was continually, it's continually perpetrated. It continues. So I think restoration of livelihoods, restoration of normalcy, if they can be anything like that, but a kind of normal, if a kind of normal can come in, I think we can reduce the cases of gender-based violence. Because I know someone will say, are we always at GBV before Cyclone Idai? But I think some of the effects of Cyclone Idai have intensified the numbers that we have been, you know, seeing, the kind of violence that men and mostly women and children have been experiencing. So I think one of the key is for us to rapidly restore, you know, the livelihoods, particularly in Chimanimani and Chipinge, And once we do that, like someone mentioned, they're still living in tents. It's a tent, it's a single tent. And there's the child, the mother, the father, and the children in there. So I think one key is for us to restore livelihoods. And then coming to COVID-19, like you mentioned, we are also, you know, having a robust sensitization, particularly because people are confined in one area, probably people quarrel and people begin to violate one another and things like that. So it all comes back to a restoration of a bit of a normalcy for us to, you know, to alleviate part of GBV. But at the same time, I think sensitization is very important. People need to be sensitized. And another thing that I forgot to mention was the issue of counseling. Counseling, trauma. You know, trauma was another thing that has been causing a lot of GBV. Trauma is another thing that has been causing, you know, a lot of people need psychosocial support, women and men at times. And I think one thing that I would say that probably as organizations we ignored, particularly in the Cyclone Idai recovery road, I think it's also, you know, counseling, psychosocial support for men. Because if you remember, they were also affected by Cyclone Idai. I think even my organization, we gave that to over 2,000 women and girls, you know, adolescents. But I think also men need it, because like now we have cases where they are the ones, like the story I gave you, the man is battering the wife and stuff like that. They're probably suffering from trauma and they need to be counseled about it. So I think those are some of the solutions I would give, Raphael.
Do you think art has a role to play in long-term, in terms of the long-term recovery and the psychosocial support within those areas?
Well, I think when we're looking at, well, I think it does. Let me give you an example of what we did when it comes to the women, in particular in our GBV response. In women and protection empowerment response, we actually took the women immediately, just after the cyclone, we took the women through recreational activities. You know, they were able, for those who can bead, we're able to do beading. We were trying to get their mind, you know, away from those things. So I think art plays a very important role, you know, because it's able to, you know, to sort of like bring that serenity and that peace to people. And especially if you involve them in it, it makes it a lot much easier, because we did it with the women, you know, and I think there was we saw a lot of change. We saw women were able to, you know, to sort of like distress from, you know, what was happening with the Cyclone Idai. But like I said, most of the times, I think we left men behind. That's one thing I can say. We left men behind. So I think art helped also to express, you know, the emotions that people were feeling. Because I think most of the times men, if we're looking at men in our society, they are told to be strong, you know, to be the father of the household. But we took the women and we went through with them through recreational activities that involved art for them to distress, you know. So I think art plays a very important role. And I think also, like what we have been doing with the exhibition, I think it is key in order for us to say, you know what, we have moved from this point, but there's hope at the end. Because if you go to Chimanimani and Chipinge right now, you can see that some of the pictures that were taken are now different from what we see. So I think art plays a huge role, especially from the people, for the people in, I think if they are to see the pictures that were taken during the cyclone and to see what we have now and the changes that have come now, I think it will bring a sort of peace to say, you know, and hope to say they can be changed and we can restore our lives. It might not be back to normal. It might be a new normal, but something better than what we have experienced. So definitely art has a role to play in our society.
Wow, thank you. As we approach the rain season, for me, all the time when I look at these images online and when I look at them here in the gallery, I get worried. And when I look at the images and the stories of children, to say when they hear rain, they're scared. What do you think could be an immediate thing that us as a nation can do before the rains come?
Thank you so much. I think this is, for me, I'm always talking about this with other colleagues who work directly in the field. You know, I think the first port of call, someone mentioned the issue of tents. I actually have a photo that I took. I took, when did I take that photo? I think I actually have photos that I took of people of tents, you know, because I was just, and especially it was in Kopa, you know, where we had the worst disaster in Kopa. Just near Kopa, near the bridge that was swept away, that is actually being built now.
Yes, yes.
There are people living in tents around that area. So I think the first thing that we can talk about is actually housing for those people. That's number one, because I think someone mentioned it, and I also have heard stories as well, where I know people, when it starts raining, they move out. They rush to their relatives to go and live somewhere, you know, in a proper house, because they are scared this tent might also, because some of them even say water runs through my tent, you know, things like that. So I think the most important thing, the first thing, is build them proper housing, because proper housing will give people at least a bit of peace, you know, to say, okay, at least I'm now in a proper house, and let's move them from there, because they are, like I'm saying, they are at Kopa. That's where most of the damage happened, but they are still there. So they need to immediately, I think they need to be moved, because once the rainy season comes, I'm sure they, you know, they're still suffering from trauma. Imagine you are still in the same place you experienced violence, or you are still in the same place you saw the disaster, you survived the disaster, and you are still living in there in a tent. So I think it's key for us and for government, for those people to be relocated, to be given proper housing. And I think it's also a road of restoration of, you know, of livelihoods, because what we have been focusing on, we have been trying to build resilience for them to be able to start up, get on their feet. As IRC, we have also helped many people to rebuild their houses, but we know that it's not enough. There are so many people who still need their houses to be built. So I think one thing that needs to be done, remember I said we have 250,000 people, and in calculation, that's around 50,000 households. That means out of those 50,000 households, we have 120,000 women and 85,000 children in numbers. So that means if we're talking about 50,000 households, we are saying probably the others didn't have their houses entirely damaged, but probably if we say there are 10,000 people who need housing, you know, I think it's key, because it means we have 10,000 people who are living in trauma. It means we have 10,000 people who most probably are trying to lodge in with their relatives in order for them to, you know, to just, you know, survive the rainy season. And if we don't move in right now to assist them, you know, it's just going to be a cycle that comes back again, back and forth again, where we are trying to give them, you know, psychosocial support, we are trying to give them counseling, but we are not dealing with the real issues. So I think key right now, Raphael, key will be, we need to move the people who are still living in tents should get houses. They should get proper, you know, sanitation, you know, proper, you know, latrines. If it's latrines, they should, when they are moved, then we can then talk about the livelihoods. As well as another key issue is counseling. I think a lot of people are suffering from trauma. You know, one thing that I've known in my own reading, I actually figured that sometimes people don't know they are suffering from trauma unless they are told they are. Because the GBV that we are seeing, it's not just normal GBV that we have been seeing. Some of it is being caused by trauma. So I think those are some of the key things that we need to, you know, quickly look at, particularly we are approaching the rainy season again.
Because just looking and also listening to some of the videos that are coming from Chimanimani via Facebook, you hear especially children talking the stories about rain, how they've lost their relatives and all that. And you can see how traumatized people are within Chimanimani and Chipinge. And looking into the future as a country, I know you've talked about trauma, you've talked about the resilience of people, which I'm sure you can be resilient to a certain level. And also looking at the comments that are coming from our viewers, I'm sure there's a comment from Michelle from Cape Town who said perhaps also art can help in grieving, reflecting, but also imagining the new. Then it can be more formalized, but also has a place for participation and getting together as humans, allowing diversity and plurality in a culture, community, and home. Because I'm sure it is, you know, you talk about Kopai, you talk about Ngangu, you talk about all those areas within Chimanimani and Chipinge. And for me, children will always live with their trauma forever. Same with adults. And I like what you've talked about the men, because men are always left behind. Because kanatichikura sevana vakomana tinge chinzi urumurume, shinga urumurume, shinga urumurume. And then shinga urumurume, it's in me. And as I grow, I get affected by my past.
So true, Raphael, so true. And I think from the conversation, even like what you said, what was spoken about last week, I think as a nation, I think it remains that we need to obviously, you know, look at what is happening currently and not, you know, turn a blind eye, because the issues are real. I myself have been in the field, and I've gotten to speak to some people and to find out, you know, I've been to the safe spaces where you hear women stories from women, and even the children you are talking about. One such story was shared to me by our WPE officer, who was telling us about a child that, you know, a few months ago, the child wet herself in class after she heard the sound, just the sound of rain, just the sound. So those are key issues that we really need to address. We need to go back to the drawing board. Like what you said, we need to first of all, like the committee you spoke about, there has to be a committee, and the committee will also be able to look at such things on how we can move on from Cyclone Idai, because we have been talking about, you know, a year later after Cyclone Idai, but our conversations should also be more on how can we move on? How can we then, you know, come back and see, you know, the impact at the end of the day, and see how then can we still go on and assist the people. So I think the same assistance that came when Cyclone Idai happened, I think we had over 100 NGOs, we had over the ministries, the ministers. I think it's still needed if we are to, you know, to have, if we are to really, you know, continue with, you know, improving the livelihoods of people. If we want the people in Manicaland and Chimanimani to sort of like normalize, you know, to become normal again, I think there's still need for us to do that. They still need, because I know we have been giving them life-saving mechanisms. We have been trying to build resilience and all of that. But I like what the other speaker said, that we cannot ignore that we still have issues that are still pending that we need to fix. And we also need to try and see with the resources available, how can we, you know, get them back to, you know, to normalize. And particularly looking at COVID-19, you mentioned about COVID-19. It also means that these are people that might also still be more affected by COVID-19 if they don't have proper sanitation. They don't have, while I said we provided over 2,000 households, you know, 500 households with latrines, with we are rehabilitating boreholes in Chimanimani and Chipinge so that people have water. But we know that there are other sections also that still need that kind of assistance that we may have not touched. So I think the people who are affected by Cyclone Idai are more affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Like I'm saying, so we need to start also talking about from now that we have done all of these, how can we move forward now in order for us to have 100% recovery? So the committee you were talking about is key, because the committee is looking at the before, during, and after. The after is very important. And most of the times, while we have done what we have done, we can say, okay, we have helped over 5,000 people, but I always feel there's more that can still be done. We talked about the housing, the sanitation, the trauma that people are still facing, the men that also need, you know, assistance when it comes to trauma. So I think as a nation, for us to move on, particularly in Manicaland, we need to go back again and say, okay, now that we have done all of this, how can we move forward? How can we, you know, still assist for these people to recover their livelihoods from where we are now? So we are now looking to the future. Yeah.
Do you think a memorial for both Chimanimani and Chipinge would be a great thing to memorialize the stories of Chimanimani and Chipinge?
Well, I think that's a tough question, but because I feel it goes both ways. Huh? A memorial would, for some, maybe it might be a good way of saying, of trying to compare and looking at where we have come from and where we are now, you know. But at the same time, and so probably people might say it's a way of healing, Manicaland in particular. So it might be a good thing, but for some, it might be maybe bringing bad memories that they don't want, that they might have buried. So I think it just depends on who is looking at it. But usually memorials are good for trying to just, you know, trying to
memorialize the trauma.
Exactly. To move from where you were, you're looking at the before and where you are now. So it might be a good way. Some people also use it to deal with trauma. Yeah. Some people use it to deal with trauma, to say, okay, to really move on. You know, people need to talk about these things, because I feel sometimes the people in those areas feel like they are forgotten. You know, people came and people are gone, you know. That's what we come in, we help, and then when we are done, we move on. So I think a memorial could be something good for them to know that, you know, we are still remembering them. We still know what happened. For example, like what we are doing, the exhibition. To some extent, it's part of like a memorial to some extent. And I think it's a good thing for people to give people hope. Probably they are seeing where we have come from and where we are now. So to really give them hope, to say, you know what, we'll definitely be normal. Everything will definitely be normal again. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pauline, for these kind words and for contributing to this very important topic, which I would say that, I mean, a few days ago, I'm sure it was a day before yesterday, another cement company donated cement for the reconstruction of houses for the people of Chimanimani and Chipinge. And it is our hope that that cement will go into good use and be able to build houses for the people of Chimanimani and Chipinge. Your last words, looking into the future.
Thank you so much, Raphael, for having me. I think my last words will just be, you know, especially to people in Manicaland, would be to say there's hope. Yeah. And I believe by God's grace that there's going to be 100% restoration. And where we are now, I believe that with the assistance that, you know, is coming from different ends, including us as the International Rescue Committee, we have tried to imagine, we have restored over 500 families, given them sanitation, you know, boreholes for people to have water. It might not be the whole 50,000 households, like I mentioned, but I believe that at the end of the day, you know, the lives are going to really get back to normal. And just to also, you know, like you said, someone donated cement for the reconstruction of housing. And I think that's the way to go. And I just hope that even as organizations, like the conversation we've started, as organizations working with different, in different areas, particularly in Chipinge and Chimanimani, the same response we have rallied up for COVID-19, you know, to quickly help with quarantine facilities, to quickly help with, you know, PPE and IPC materials, that will also be able to remember and you know, restore some of the things that still need to be restored, like the housing we were talking about, the trauma that people are still facing. So just as my last contribution to say, yeah, I believe, you know, Manika land will be restored to the glory that it had before. And I believe that as we continue to work together, you know, we'll be able to restore livelihoods, we'll be able to, you know, to move from that trauma to a better hope and a better future. Thanks, Raphael.
Thank you very much, Pauline Hurungudo, who is with the International Rescue Committee as the Communications Officer. And allow me to also thank you for joining into these Harare Conversations. And also allow me to thank our partners and sponsors. That includes Oxfam, Catholic Agents for Overseas Development, United Nations, Zimbabwe, USAID, US Embassy, Veld Hunger, Save the Children, Miracle Missions, Zim Papers, Theatre in the Park, the Met Department, GOL, and the International Rescue Committee, who today was part of the panel for this conversation. So look forward to the next Harare conversation. That will be again next week, and we'll get some of our supporters and sponsors to be part of the panel so that we can interrogate the issues pertaining disaster management and disaster preparedness, disaster recovery, and many issues that we are actually showing here at the National Gallery of Zimbabwe's Aftershock, Reimagining Life After Cyclone Idai exhibition that will see itself here in Harare and will travel to Bulawayo, will also travel to Mutare, Manicaland, so that the people of Manicaland can also be able to look and see the magnitude of the disaster that our fellow citizens faced, including those in Mozambique and in Malawi. And for the Zimbabwean and for the Harare audience, you can actually Google our website and be able to see the exhibition online. That's where you can see the magnitude of the disaster that struck both Chimanimani and Chipinge. I thank you. See you next time. Ngiyabonga. Asante sana.